A new book coming out this summer tells the inspiring story of a Holocaust survivor from here in the North Country who courageously returned to the world's most notorious concentration camp at Auschwitz, where his parents and many of his relatives were murdered. Writer and co-producer Julie Canepa and filmmakers Frederick and Bruce Carlin joined us in our studios recently to talk about that memorable trip, their film going national, and Julie's new book that looks at Vladimir's incredible life. Julie, you accompanied Vladimir on that trip. You had written some articles about him for a local newspaper, Sun Community News, and then that grew into a friendship, and he asked you to go with him on this trip?
Yes, it was sort of an evolution. I met Vladimir at Lake Forest, where he lives, through my friend Tim Hartnett. We played music there, and we started going back to his place and having a shot of his slivovitz and his usual hospitality. And as I gradually got to know him, he told me some stories about his Holocaust experience. And I felt like they were stories that many people may never have heard before. So I did write that series of articles for the Sun. And after that came out, I thought there was more to his story, and I was really hoping that we could record it for posterity in some way. So that's when I reached out to Paul and asked him if he might get some video of Vladimir telling his story.
We decided we would at least get an interview recorded and then look for funding and, that process, because, a great idea is a great idea, but to take on a full documentary, we needed some capital. So we did the interview. You're immediately enthralled with Vladimir. You can't help but love him, and his story was amazing. So Julie and I talked, and we said, okay, let's look for some funding. And then November of that year, she said, Vladimir just got a letter, and he got asked to go back in January for the 75th celebration of the liberation of the camp. And I was like, now that's an amazing story if we could follow him back. We needed to convince Vladimir, and he was fine with letting us come along. I knew Julie was going to be with Vladimir the whole time, and I knew I couldn't probably do all that alone, so that's when I contacted Bruce, who we've worked on some documentaries together. Said, Bruce, what do you think? He's a big World War II guy. And
my mom is British. She lived throughout the bombing of England during World War II. Her village was constantly bombed. And they were on the coast, and the bombers on their way back to Europe would drop off whatever they hadn't dropped on London. And so I just grew up knowing about World War II, about the Holocaust, about it, and I've read a lot about it, and this was like, wow, this is just an amazing opportunity. So.
And Julie, Vladimir was 95 at the time, and going to undertake this an incredibly emotional trip, returning to the concentration camp where he lost his family. Both of his parents died there. Such a horrible, horrible place. But it seems he was determined to go back. He wanted to go back and see it one last time.
Yes, he actually had the opportunity to go back for the 70th anniversary of the liberation of the camp. But in that year, in 2015, his wife Kitty passed, so that wasn't something that he could actually do. So just the stars aligned, and the timing was just perfect for him to go back and make this journey to honor his relatives, over 30 of which had perished there, and also probably about the same amount of Kitty's family had died during the Holocaust as well. So I think the timing was right. His health was still just about at the point where he got approval from his doctor, and then we said, okay, we're going to do this.
You knew how incredibly powerful this story could be.
When we were getting to know each other, Vladimir told me some stories that I think I had never heard before. I think many people are exposed to Holocaust stories in movies and in books, and I think to start with, the Czech experience was a different angle on presenting this story, but also Vladimir's memory is amazing. And so that, I think, was the defining factor, because the stories that he was able to recall were clear and sharp, as if he told them as if they had happened yesterday, and some of them were definitely things that I think people might never have known Holocaust survivors had experienced. So it was definitely a really powerful and important story to tell.
And Paul, you and Bruce both knew this would be a great story, a powerful film. How challenging, though, was it to shoot this documentary?
It was pretty challenging for sure. We were traveling around Europe just with a backpack of camera equipment. We couldn't bring too much stuff, so literally a backpack, no tripod. We shot it all handheld.
And also, just what angle would we take that would make this different than other stories about survivors returning? And we felt that, number one, having Julie's voice be there and kind of that bouncing off of Julie's youth and Vladimir's age and their friendship, and how how through her eyes as well as Vladimir's.
A lot of the other big challenges are, for a documentary, you have to have the visuals. So, a lot of this parts of his life that, we weren't sure, how are we going to find a visual for this? So a lot of it is just, how do you visually show these things?
And I think a lot of people may be surprised by the number of photographs, thinking that perhaps they had been lost, but you were able to find them through relatives?
Yes, that's one of the things. Probably the most asked question is if he was in a concentration camp, all his family, perished, how did those photos survive? But they were able to give them to neighbors and
non-Jewish neighbors and friends.
Neighbors to hold.
Yeah.
Is there a photograph for him that is the most powerful, the most memorable, the most emotional that he's ever talked about?
I think some of the ones with just Vladimir as a youth with his mother, they're so endearing.
I think that's true. I think the ones with his mother, all the experiences that he shared with her when he was young, because he did spend most of his time with her while his father was working. His mother taught him how to ski and how to ice skate, and they spent time in the mountains in Czechoslovakia together, and there are a lot of pictures of that. But I think what is also really telling is the absence of photos, because after the German occupation of Czechoslovakia, they confiscated all cameras. So there was a point where they weren't in Terezin concentration camp. They were still living in their home in the town of Pardubice, but they were unable to take photos because it was forbidden. So they not only had their radios were confiscated, their cameras were confiscated, and even their all of the pets, their domestic animals, cats, dogs, horses, were confiscated by the Nazis. The pets were auctioned off. And that is actually one great story where they had a dog in their family. His name was Chiggy. They rounded up all of the domestic pets and they had an auction, and any animals that were not purchased at the auction were going to be destroyed. So he had an aunt who was not Jewish, who was able to purchase their family dog at auction, and she kept it for years in the town. And after the war, he was reunited with the dog. It was one of the few family members that had survived the war.
Julie, you narrate the story, telling us how you joined Vladimir on the trip, reliving what it was like there in the concentration camp with him, how he was able to survive, what life was like after he was freed. And in the film, you talk with him about his experiences, his memories, his emotions being back there. How was that for you to be able to tell his story and share his story?
I think part of the reason why we sort of ended up structuring the film the way that we did is because Vladimir, as many people know, keeps his emotions very close to the vest. He's not, while he's a very welcoming and friendly and caring person, his own emotions about that time he does, keep very private.
Julie became the emotion of the story, I think. And I think that it's important because Julie was sort of that conduit, I think, to the younger generations out there that might be learning about this. She was like able to ask questions in the show, like, what was he thinking on the way there? And kind of, Vladimir wouldn't give us what he was thinking on the way there, but she was able to kind of interpret that for the viewer.
He's a man of few words. He's stoic, he's guarded,
Very much so, yeah.
He uses humor, but so in this case, you being with him were able to interpret what he was feeling. We did see some emotion when he visited the barracks?
I mean, that was towards the end of the day. We'd been 4 or 5 hours of traveling around, seeing a lot of the camp, and I think at that point we were all covered in mud on our shoes and tired, and I think it really hit home when he got in there, and that was probably, the most emotional point for him.
And Vladimir is now 98. And we see in the documentary when he returned home during COVID, he had some health issues. Is he doing okay?
Yes, he is doing very well for somebody who's 98, and I just saw him the other day, and he said he thinks he has to stick around until he's 100.
The film premiered that September after you returned. During the pandemic, you had screenings at the historic Strand Theater in Plattsburgh, great crowds and a wonderful response to the film.
Yeah, it was amazing.
Yeah, they were, I believe the first was sold out or mostly sold out, and the second one was really full, and people just reacted to Vladimir so much when, he had a 5-minute.
5-minute standing ovation at the end. He stood up and turned around, and everything we did was worth it at that moment.
And during that discussion at the Strand, you all and Vladimir talked about the importance of making and sharing this film, keeping this story alive so that future generations hear about this, hear about what happened to Vladimir and his family and millions of other families, so that the world never forgets.
Yeah, I mean, that was our main goal, I think, for all of us, right from the get-go. As it turned out, we never found any funding for this program, so it's literally a labor of love, and we've since found some success with film festivals and nominated for an Emmy for humanitarian category. So it's getting success in that regards, but to us it was more important that the world gets a chance to see this story and learn about Vladimir.
And in addition, through the PBS and APT, it was distributed to, I believe, 97% of the stations.
And congratulations on the Emmy nomination. We expect within a few days here in June, you're going to hear about that, and keeping our fingers crossed for you. That would be a nice honor.
I mean, you don't do these things for awards, but when you get nominated, it's a great honor. So, and then to win, that'll be just awesome.
And Julie, you did return. You returned to Poland, and you returned to Vladimir's hometown.
Yes.
To write a book about his life story.
Yes. Well, initially I thought the trip back to Prague was going to be to help me with the book and to help me do some research and sort of walk the streets that Vladimir had walked with his parents and go to some of the places that he had gone with them. And then once I was there, there was a movement and some very hardworking people that were putting together a memorial for the Jewish population of his hometown of Pardubice who had been deported to Terezin. They memorialized it on the building where they had held all of these people, including Vladimir and his parents. And it was just, and then after this event, we actually showed the film to people who were from the town. And it was just incredibly impactful. The audience responded, even though many people, there was a translator there, so everyone's comments were being translated from Czech into English for me. But it was just an incredible experience to show it to people from his hometown.
And the book is soon out.
Yes.
And how was that, writing that book for you?
This is actually a historical fiction. It's a novel based on Vladimir and his wife Kitty's life, and I had never done that before, and that was proved to be very much of a challenge, especially trying to work through the pandemic and trying to get all the information I needed and trying to make sure that not only was I telling his story accurately, but also that I was placing everything in the right historical context. So it required a lot of research, and I don't think I really anticipated that at first.
Paul Frederick, Bruce Carlin, Julie Canepa, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us.
Oh, thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
Julie's new novel, titled The Missing Star, tells the story of Vladimir and his wife, Kitty Lowy, their lives under German occupation and deportation to Terezin Ghetto, where they met and vowed to reunite after the war. The book is being released next week on June 6, and it will be available during a special presentation of Return to Auschwitz, the survival of Vladimir Munk. You can watch that here on Mountain Lake PBS this coming Tuesday at 8 p.m.